I wanted to share some of my thoughts about the infinite or the nature of infinity because I think it's a really interesting topic where I watched a video quite a while back actually about mathematicians who made the statement that there are larger and smaller infinities. And I'll go into the explanation of what they mean by that in a moment. But the revelation that I had while watching the video was that the way people look at different things, things that can even be essentially objective in a lot of ways, like math is in many ways objective, uh, even that has a subjective element to it, where depending on your personal purpose and perspective, one view may be superior to another view, but which view benefits you more depends on your personal goal and what you're using that concept for, how it fits into a larger macro model uh, that is useful to you. So, how well it fits into your system, I would say. So, to go into the explanation of what they meant by this, they talked about the idea of there being two number sets. So, we'll call one A and one B, right? And they're saying that the number set of A is only whole numbers, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And then the number set for B includes decimals. So you have 1, 1.1, 1.2, so on and so forth. And so their logic was that if you compare number set A to B, B contains more numbers and has the potential to contain more numbers because there's no numbers between 1 and 2 in A, but there are many numbers between 1 and 2 in set B. And so essentially they're saying it's a denser number set. And because it is a denser number set, that regardless of whether or not you take the set to infinity, B will always be a larger number set if they're essentially being counted at the same rate, if that makes sense. So if we go up to 5 and we pause, then in this number set there's only 5, but in this number set there's more than 5 numbers, right? Because you have decimals in between. So you can really see their logic and how they come to this conclusion. But for me personally, it betrays the true essence and spirit of what it means to be infinite. It's to me, it intuitively feels like the wrong way to look at it because they're valuing something that I don't value. So again, the revelation that I had when thinking about this was that it's not that they're wrong and that I'm right. It's that they're valuing something different about infinity. What they're using infinity for within their own system and model is not the same thing that I'm using it for. So let me explain real quick what I mean by valuing different things. So to them, the idea that if you count this way, that this number set is bigger, the most important thing here is how it works within the sort of established rules of math as a counting system, right? And that isn't important really to me at all. I'm a very spiritual, mystical, artistic, creative type of person, and I think abstractly in terms of symbolism. So to me, what numbers represent is more like the spirit of something. Like if you think about the number 1, it represents one object, right? So it's not the number that I'm particularly concerned about, it's what it's symbolic of, the object, and how that object, regardless of what the object is, whether it's a ball or a coin or a cup, how that object relates to other things. Like for example, if you split the object in half, you now have two objects that are equal to one half of the original object, right? So this relationship is what's important to me, not the actual technical math. And so it's the difference between a sort of spiritual view of it and a technical, literal view of it, an abstract versus a literal view of it, that defines what's important to us. And so I want to explain my point of view of why I don't believe that one infinity can ever be larger than the other infinity. And I'm going to use the fundamental equation to do this. So kind of in the middle here, I'll create a separate group where, let's say, for example, that we use the fundamental equation where it's, 0 equals x minus x, right? It's not the best 0. 0 equals x minus x. So the fundamental equation has an infinite number of different sets, right? So it can be 1 minus 1. It can be, some complex thing with parentheses where you get really in depth, and that can go down to infinity. But it's not important which number set you are using so much as they all add up to 0. And so to me, the important thing here is the relationship between 0 and the individual aspects of 0, or the way that 0 is divided up on the right side of the equation. So you could say that in some versions of 0, in some versions of the fundamental equation, that 1 0 has more individual parts than another 0, right? Like if we have 1 minus 1, there are 2 parts to this whole, to this 0. And if we have another one where we say, for example, 10 plus 10 equals, or sorry, minus 10 plus 10, then there are technically 4 parts, or you could even argue abstractly that there are 5 parts because this whole is different from these individual pieces. So I would not say that these two zeros are different, right? Because I'm focused on the essence of what these two zeros really are and what they represent and their relationship with the other side of the equation, which is that the left side of the equation represents the whole set. And the whole does not change based on the set. You see what I mean? So regardless of what we put on the right side of the equation, the zero does not change in its nature or essence. So there's no point in my model of saying that this is a larger, or sorry, this is a smaller and this is a larger data set, because all that's really saying is you're dividing the whole up into more or fewer parts. Let's say if we've got the 2 parts, that would be like cutting in half, right? Whereas if we have the 4 parts, that's like cutting it in 4. But you see how the actual whole did not change in any way, shape, or form. So to say that this is a larger data set than this is not really true in the way that I think they're trying to say it, or at least in the way that it matters to me. Because the way I view this is you're saying that you're cutting the whole or the infinite, right? Because all this ends up equaling infinite. Both of these data sets are infinite. They're not adding up the parts in terms of having a different whole and saying, oh, this, if we have 100 numbers in this data set and 1,000 numbers of this data set, if we count the numbers, then this one has 100 and this one has 1,000. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that this infinity is less dense than this infinity, that this is a larger infinity. And I think that I can agree to some degree with the concept of a denser infinity, because if we think about the number of parts, having 4 parts, you could say is a denser division, right, of the whole. But because it does not change the nature of the whole itself, you're not changing the nature of the infinity either by having this data set versus this data set. So when they say that this data set B is larger, that infinity is larger, I think that they're making an error based on how I view the nature or the essence or the spirit of the thing itself. Because the spirit of the infinite is the infinite as a whole, right? It's not infinite as the pieces that make it up, because that's a dualistic view of the infinite. But they're not talking about the dualistic mode of it. They're not talking about the number of places between one number and another. They're talking about how that all adds up to the infinite. So as soon as you involve the whole, if the whole of one is the same as the whole of the other, then there is no difference. If this 0 is the same as this 0, right, where we have the parentheses, regardless of the number of parts, then these two are all I care about, and these two are exactly equal to each other. And in the same way, I would say that the two infinites are equal to each other. So therefore, you cannot say that one infinite is larger than the other. I don't think that's an accurate statement, at least based on how I view what is important and what is valuable in terms of the spirit. So the way I understand infinity is that it is an undetermined state. So if we think about our models that we've talked about previously, an undetermined state is nothing, right? And you could also say that it's everything because it is potential, right? So this comes back to the concept of probability and potential. So the idea is that the second you determine what is contained within an infinity, and I'm not talking about like a pattern. A pattern is fine. A pattern can still be infinite. But the second you say like, okay, this infinity contains this limited set of numbers, it is no longer infinite, right? Because the second you place the limitation on the data set, it is no longer an infinite data set. So by the nature, by the essence and spirit of the infinite, it cannot be a determined state, which means that you never reach the point where you can tally up which data set has a larger number, because regardless of which data set has more density, or has a larger number of pieces in terms of the way the pattern is counting, the pattern never stops counting, else it ceases to be infinite. So once we recognize the fact that the infinite is an undetermined state, which means that it is nothing and everything at the same time, right? So it's all the possible numbers within that data set, and it's also none of the numbers within that data set. And what I mean by none of the numbers is that you can't say it is specifically this group of numbers, because the second you do that, you exclude the numbers that are not already in that group, which makes it a finite group of numbers, right? So if I say it contains 1, 2, and 3, it's not an infinite data set. It's a finite data set. It's the opposite of an infinite data set. So you have to always kind of do the dot, 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 or the arrow, because the nature, the spirit, the essence of the infinite is to say, well, this doesn't really matter in the sense that we're still counting, right? There's still the potential for it to change. There's still the potential for it to become more than it is. And so that is what I'm kind of getting at by the idea of, it's not important which pattern you're counting with so much as it is important that it never stops counting. And because it never stops counting, you cannot say what it does and doesn't contain. You cannot say that it's bigger or smaller, because bigger and smaller are finite quantities, right? In order to compare two quantities, they have to be finite. When you're comparing two infinities, it's like comparing two zeros. One zero cannot be bigger than the other zero, because by the nature of what they are, they're equal, right? Infinity is always equal to infinity. So you can't say one is bigger or larger than the other, because that would then make them not equal. So kind of expanding upon this idea of using the fundamental equation and also referring the infinite back to this undetermined state of nothingness, we kind of get to the idea that it's neither a negative or a positive, right? And that's another thing that it has in common with zero, and this becomes more and more important as you get deeper into the spiritual meaning of infinite. And I say that the spiritual meaning of infinite, not to make it like a woo-woo subject. I'm sure that a lot of people view my opinions as woo, and that's fine. But I'm not saying like something doesn't have to be true if it's spiritual. Like it doesn't have to be able to hold up to scrutiny if it's spiritual. What I'm saying is that it goes back to the concept of abstract versus literal. So in an abstract model, what's important is the internal consistency, right? So if you think of like a fantasy, right? Like if you think about a world, a fictional world where you are writing a character with superpowers, what makes it a good or a bad story is not whether it's scientifically accurate, right? We're in a world of fantasy, so we're not really concerned with scientifically accurate, but it has to be internally consistent. Otherwise, the reader loses track of what their expectations are for what can and can't happen, and it starts to make them incapable of living in a state of suspended disbelief, right? They no longer respect the world that they're viewing, not because it's unrealistic, but because it's not internally consistent. And so when I talk about things being more spiritual or abstract or artistic, I'm talking about a different model with a different set of values, but that is still internally consistent within itself. So I think that's like more the mythological kind of concept, is that within a particular story, as long as there's internal consistency, then the story has integrity. And so I'm not saying that my story or my way of viewing things like math or the infinite are superior. I'm saying that my model is internally consistent and their model is not consistent with my model. So their model doesn't work within my model, and my model likely doesn't work within theirs. But because I'm trying to achieve something different than they are with my model, I don't really want to use their model. And I think that their model can often disrupt people who are in the process of developing more spiritual or abstract models, because they want to incorporate these literal definitions and meanings, but they really can't, because of the fact that they don't coincide well. They don't mirror the internal consistency of the abstract model. And so people will abandon their abstract models because they say, oh, well, that's not consistent with reality. Well, not necessarily. Reality itself is a very abstract thing. And so if you say we have to limit ourselves to one way of viewing it, then yeah, you can make statements like, this isn't real or this isn't true. But if you allow yourself to say, well, the most important thing is it internally consistent, right? So like, say, for example, if we talk about God creating the universe, your concept of God would probably be very different from mine. But if we talk about a creator of the universe, if science or if math or if anything disagrees with that and says that's not possible because of, X, Y, and Z, when the universe was in this state in the beginning, it was just particles and energy and there was no thinking animal. So therefore nothing like a God could exist, right? If they say that, and they're using their logic, their rationale, their internal consistencies to prove that, if you buy into their model, then you're likely going to agree with them. But if you don't buy into that model, it's not necessarily that you're saying their logic is wrong. You're essentially saying that what they're applying, the value system that they're applying, is not the value system that you're applying. So say, for example, something like panpsychism, or the models that I talk about where we say that the universe is kind of built off of a foundation of mind rather than mind being built off of a foundation of matter, and that matter exists within the mind rather than the other way around. That completely turns their model upside down because they're not incorporating that. They're not accounting for that at all because they don't believe it's true. But the two models branch out, right? So like, here's the premise, and then here are the two models. So we'll say this is the literal, this is the abstract. Wow, sorry for the horrible writing. So I'm writing with a mouse, not with a pen, so it's harder. So if this is the premise, let's say mind over matter, right? So if we take this premise as true, then we end up with a very abstract model, sort of like panpsychism or simulation theory or, life is a dream, that sort of a thing, right? Something spiritual. And if we take this premise as false, then we end up with a more literal, scientific, mathematical, a more mainstream kind of idea. And so the problem is that we can't prove or disprove this premise, right? There's no way of measuring whether or not the universe came from a mind. So this premise is in a state that is undetermined, and therefore we have to operate from the idea that we have no data because this is both true and false, right? Not to say that it is literally true and false in the sense that both sides are absolutely true, because these are mutually exclusive. In some ways, you could say that it is either true or false. But in this uncertain state it is in, where we have no way of measuring and determining what the truth is, it can be both true and false. So without being able to prove or disprove this premise, neither of these models is correct or incorrect. The most important thing is, are they internally consistent from this point on? Right? Like, can you explain everything that you witness in the world with this model? If yes, then it's fine. If you can explain everything in the world with this model, then it's fine, because they're both being built off of an uncertain premise, and a different interpretation of an uncertain premise. So the most important thing there is the internal consistency again. So now I want to get back to this sort of idea of zero and infinity being similar to each other, and why infinity, like zero, is the only other truly neutral, non-polarized number. So let's say, for example, that we include only negative numbers in an infinite set, right? So let's say, for example, that we're counting 1, negative 2, negative 3, okay? So we know that this infinite set is only going to contain negative numbers. Is this a negative infinity? Wow. Is this a negative infinity? Let's try that again. Okay. Now, if you take the sort of literal mathematic mainstream view, the sort of technical view, I think that they would say yes. I think they would call this a negative infinity. And I would say, if you take the more abstract spiritual view, which is more valuing the essence of what infinity is rather than this sort of technical literal concept, then I would say no, that it is not a negative infinity, because even though you are stating that it will only ever contain negative numbers, the numbers that make up the whole are not important so long as they still add up to the whole. Okay? And so what I mean by that is, if we again look at the fundamental equation, the idea that all of this equals this means that this is always neutral in relationship to this. Okay? So what I mean by neutral in relationship to it is, if we draw the circle, right? I don't care how you divide this up or whether you call it negative or positive. These can all be -1 for all I care, right? But the point is that their relationship with the whole is always neutral, because the whole has nothing except for itself to compare itself to, and therefore it's always equal to itself, which makes it neutral. I know that's a little bit weird and abstract, so I'll try to explain it in a different way. So if we take this data set and we say that it is an undetermined number of negative numbers, then even though we know that it will never contain positive numbers, we also know that the numbers will never stop being counted. And so what you're essentially saying is that regardless of the fact that it contains negative numbers, the whole is not negative because the whole is never measured. Okay? Remember that it is an undetermined state. Okay? And by undetermined, we mean unmeasured. Therefore, it is nothing and everything, all right, within its own potential. And you would say, well, but isn't the potential negative because it only contains negative numbers? No, because despite the fact that the data set only contains negative numbers, the data set is never officially measured, which means that the infinite only ever contains one state, which is undetermined. And an undetermined state can neither be negative nor positive. I hope that's making sense now. So it's like saying, if you have an infinite number of negative numbers, what is the value of that data set? Well, the value is infinity, right? So it's not going to be like -10 or -1 million, right? And so these are actual numbers. Those actual numbers have actual polarity. But a number that does not have a finite value cannot have polarity. What else is like this? 0. 0 is the only other number like that besides infinity, because 0, like infinity, is more of a conceptual number than it is a literal object, right? Because it only ever represents the whole or the absence of something. It never actually represents the presence of something other than the whole or the absence of something, which means that you can't count it. You can't say, like, I have 0 of something. What you're really saying is that I don't have any of that thing, right? So it's neither positive or negative, because what you're essentially saying is that the whole adds up to 0. The whole is 0. So because of this relationship between the number set and the whole, you end up, or I should say I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would say that that number set, regardless of what it contains, even if it only contains negative numbers as a set, is never truly counted, and that is the only way that it can be infinite, and therefore the infinite can never have a polarity. It can never be a negative or a positive infinity. So I'm going to put it right here on the number line, right above 0, because these are the only two numbers that are neither negative or positive. You can count to infinity in either direction, just like you can count negative or positive away from 0. So these two have a center line, a center axis, that they're the only two numbers that they're on this axis together. Now, when you count in these other directions, the number arrow, right, would imply that you're getting further and further away from 0, right? And in a sense, that is true. You're getting further and further away from 0. So as you count to the left, you're getting more negative, right? As you count to the right, you are getting more positive. You're increasing the positive polarity, or the positive energy, the positive value. So you would think that this would just be a flat plane, right? And by a flat plane, I mean, like, if you think of geometry, right? Like, this would be something standing on a flat plane, right? So these would be the axes of the flat plane. Whereas if you had this other dimension like up or down, then it would be more three-dimensional, right? We would be able to draw the cube, so on and so forth. So, oops, that's not how you draw a cube. Get rid of that line. So anyways, I would state that only from a certain perspective does this remain a flat plane. If you cut it off, like if you just look at it like this, in a finite plane, it becomes flat, right? But in an infinite plane, it's a sphere. Now, let me explain why. So, we know, I shouldn't say we know, if you are following my abstract model, and if everything I said makes sense to you, and you agree that this cannot be a negative or a positive number because it is an undetermined, undefined number, then what we would essentially say is that you're counting, as you go in this direction toward this arrow, as you go toward this arrow, you are counting toward infinity, right? But infinity is not over here. It's not over there, right? Because that would imply that the infinity is the most negative number, but it's not. It's neither negative nor a number, like 0. It is a conceptual number that is not specifically finite. So, because of its relationship to the whole. So, if you think about how we would actually count toward infinity while moving in the arrow of this greater negative value, it would actually look like this, right? So it would curve. And you can think of this, you can imagine this as the numbers are getting bigger, they're actually getting farther away and smaller, right? And so as they're getting smaller and farther away, it's creating this sort of ellipse effect where this, what looks like a flat plane, is actually a curved plane. It is a curved angle or line. And so if you think about how a circle looks, right? If I draw a circle, you would say that that's a curve, right? The whole surface of the circle is a curve. But if we take a small enough sample of this circle and we look at it, it will look straight to us, right? Because this is all perspective. That's why I prefer the abstract model, because the abstract is better at accounting for relativity. And I think even within science and math, that relativity is increasing in value and importance. And I think that relativity relies more on abstract interpretations of things rather than literal interpretations of things, which is not to say that the literal interpretation of things is inaccurate. It's just it's only accurate within certain scales and perspectives, right? Just like this is only a flat plane or arrow within a limited perspective, within a finite system, right? But as soon as we make the system infinite, which is the true state of reality, reality is a truly infinite state. It is an undetermined infinite state, just like the fundamental equation that I'm always talking about. This is a infinite state. Once we account for that, it becomes a 3D sphere, right? Where all the different directions can lead to, and this is going to look kind of weird, but all the different directions can lead to infinity from 0. Okay, and I'll get more into this in a second about why that's a very spiritual model in nature. But basically, if you think about like a toroid, right, like a magnetic toroid looks something like this, right? So it's got a vertical axis, which is the neutral axis, and then it has these fields, or I forget what the technical word for it is, but basically it has these curvatures that come out of it, right? So this is kind of like what a magnet looks like if you think about the magnet like this. As the electrons or the magnetic charge flows from one end to the other, it creates this field, this magnetic field with these arrows, right? And the arrows flow out of one side and into the other side, okay? So this is a expansive and contractive force, right? And what's another way of thinking about this? A positive and a negative force, right? So you can see how all of this always comes back to this concept of the most important thing to understand is the whole, right? The whole is everything and nothing. The whole is what determines how things behave relative to each other. And so if we think about like a 3D sphere, right? the center would be 1 infinity, right? And we'll call that 0. 0 and infinity are essentially the same thing. And that would probably require a different video because this one's already running a bit longer than I intended. And the outer layer you could say would be something like the other infinity, which is what we think of as infinity, right? The maximum limit. So they're both essentially the same thing. They're both different ways of viewing the whole. Or you could even say that the outer layer is 0 and the inner layer is infinity. It really doesn't matter. Honestly, it doesn't matter. It just depends on which direction you want to move in. But the point is that as you are moving from one point to the other, the paths that you are taking are just these arrows right here on the bottom, right? This is just, so if we split this, right, this would be the negative side and this would be the positive side, right? So you're just, like if you started, and this is 0, right? If this bottom pole is 0, which is another way of looking at it versus the inner, the outer, it doesn't matter. It's all about the relationships of the whole. If this bottom pole is 0, then this would just be a number line that is infinite, leading to the point of infinity, which is an unreachable point, right? That's why it is such an abstract concept. And so you're slowly curving toward, but never reaching infinity. And so because you're never reaching it, it is an undetermined state, just like 0. And so the 0 is really looping back on itself. And again, this goes into the concept of 0 and infinity, both being two versions of the same state. And if you think about the fundamental equation up here, this is the infinite, right? There are an infinite number of ways to represent x minus x. That is the infinite. That is this. Whereas 0 can be translated into infinity, which is why they're equal, but 0 only has one way of representing itself, which is 0. Right? So again, this is the two poles around which all the positive and negative polarities curve. So I want to end this. I want to end this with bringing this back to the Kabalistic Tree of Life, which some of you might be familiar with and some of you might not be, and some of you might respect and some of you might think it's ridiculous. But I do think that, again, because I have, personally, this very abstract view, and I want internal consistency within the abstract relativistic nature of reality, based on my yes to the question of is mind over matter. I'm not even going to bother writing that. You remember what I said. So if you look at the Kabalistic Tree of Life, right, it basically looks something like this. I'm going to draw more my version. Well, I guess I'll draw their version. Right. So if you think about the top, right, which is, I believe it's pronounced Kiter, and then the bottom, which is Malkut. Malkut. So this is the unseen, right? So the unseen, I should really use the unseen source, and this is the seen form, okay? But they're both on the same axis. It's important to think about this in terms of the axes. And so these are negative and positive, right? That are different ways of flowing, different axes of flowing to the same result, okay? There are different ways of achieving the same result. And even this, the way it spirals down, I don't want to get into it, but it's all geometric. And it's all conceptual math. But basically, the point of this is that if you understand the top, Kiter, to be the unseen source, right, of the rest of the tree, then what would this be? This is the Sephiroth. This would be infinity, right? Or it could be 0, either one depending on how you look at it. Because what do these both have in common? They're undetermined. And what is something that undetermined? What state is it in? It's in a state of nothingness and everything. So that means that it is not a measured state. What do we call something that is not measured? Unseen, right? So basically, we are moving from the unseen form of nothingness into the seen form of nothingness, okay? So both of these are 0 and infinity, but they're the non-dual versus the dual states of these. So we go back into the fundamental equation. The Kabalistic Tree of Life is just another abstract representation of the fundamental equation. So if we take the Kabalistic Tree of Life, what we're looking at is the ways that we can go from 0 to x minus x. That's what this is. These are different pathways, different elements that are necessary to understand the relationship between 0 equals x minus x, right? Or the different states of infinity. And again, 0 and infinity are essentially the same thing, so you can almost use them interchangeably. Like what is infinity times 1? Well, it's infinity. What's 0 times 1? It's 0. Nothing else has that I guess 1's a bad number to use there, isn't it? So what's infinity times 2? It's infinity. What's 0 times 2? It's 0, right? No other numbers have that relationship with other numbers because these are the only two non-polarized numbers. They're the only two numbers that are this conceptual whole in the way that they are, right? And so I guess that's pretty much it. I just wanted to kind of outline all of this and talk about the way that using abstract thinking to draw these conclusions, it still requires internal consistency like literal interpretations of math and science do, but it doesn't necessarily come to the same conclusions just because it's internally consistent. And I personally prefer this pathway because it allows me to have what I consider a deeper understanding, not necessarily a more specific or exact, because it's more of a macro view than a micro view. And I think both are important and necessary. But I think when people make statements like, the math channel saying that one infinity can be larger than another, I think that it kind of skews society away from abstract thinking and more toward this sort of literal thinking, like we're now measuring infinity. What do you mean one is bigger than the other? It kind of defeats the whole purpose of the concept of infinity. And I think in a weird way that sort of stabs at or eats at or erodes the spiritual nature of our mind and the way we think and the way we relate things to each other. Right? And so if you think about all of this all comes back to the idea of the great cycle, which is the beginning and the end are the same point, right? The beginning and the end are different variations of this, right? This final equation. And so whether it's birth or death, right? You're born here and you die here, whatever the case may be, it's all symbolic for the same cycle, the great cycle. And all of it comes back from the fact that there's this sort of spherical, toroidal, three-dimensional model of reality that, depending on if you're looking at a finite or infinite slice, it becomes two-dimensional or three-dimensional or four-dimensional, so on and so forth, and it becomes finite or infinite. And in order to understand it, you have to look at both, right? Because if you just look at the whole, the infinite, then yes, you understand that the true nature of reality is infinite, but what is there? How do you make a spacecraft? How do you make a space rocket fly with just infinity? You don't, right? It's a holistic view, yes, but we need the macro and the micro, right? So you need the x minus x. You need the also dualistic, the more literal view of things. I just don't think that you should look at it this way at the expense of this way. I don't think that we should eliminate one. And I prefer this way because I'm a more artistic, creative person. But I think that you always have to be willing to listen to and understand both sides. Because like I said at the beginning, there is a rationality to the idea that one infinity contains a larger number set or one infinity contains a negative number set. There's rationality to that. I just don't think that it fits into the bigger picture. Just like a flat plane is true in a finite picture, but on the larger scale, it is actually a curve. It is actually a three-dimensional plane. So we always have to balance out the dual and the non-dual views of things if we want to have a holistic understanding of ourselves, our minds, and the universe. And that's all I have to say today.